This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, everybody, and what a delight it is to actually see you all here face to face. It is truly wonderful. My name is Pauline Carr and I'm the Chancellor of the University of South Australia, and I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on this evening is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia, to hear from one of the most insightful and considered voices in Australia's international relations, Senator, the Honourable Penny Wong. The Hawke Centre is committed to delivering a diverse program of free events and exhibitions throughout the year, and I know that many of you are regular attendees. These events and exhibitions reflect our fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity, and building our future. This event is being recorded and a video will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. And we, of course, encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not join us here tonight. As we are filming, just make sure that you switch your phones to silent to avoid any interruptions. And I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker, Senator the Honourable Penny Wong. Penny is Senator for South Australia, the Senate Leader of the Australian Labor Party, the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Leader of the Opposition in the Senate. Entering the Australian Senate in 2001, she has served as Shadow Minister for Employment and Workforce Participation in 2005, Shadow Minister for Corporate Governance and Responsibility, also in 2005, Minister for Climate Change and Water in 2007, Minister for Climate Change, Energy Efficiency and Water in 2010, Minister for Finance and Deregulation in 2010, and Deputy Leader of the Government in the Senate in 2013. Prior to her career in Parliament, Senator Wong worked at the CFMEU in the National Executive of the National Union of Students and as a lawyer and political advisor. She graduated from the University of Adelaide with bachelor degrees in arts and law. Senator Wong will be in conversation with Tori Shepherd, columnist at The Advertiser, freelance writer and author of On Freedom. It is now my very great pleasure to formally welcome the Honourable Penny Wong and Tori Shepherd.
Thanks, Pauline. Thank you.
Oh, that's a lot of clapping. It's a lot of pressure.
I'm just feeling the pressure of having to be insightful and considered.
Right. You have to be insightful and considered and explain to us how globalisation is going to end in just 1 hour. No pressure. I do have here that I'm going to start you off with a nice warm-up question, though. How has it been for you? I mean, you've been mostly focused on Australians being stranded overseas, but how have you personally found the entirely different life we're all now living?
Well, it's the most time I have spent with either my partner or my children ever. And so far it's been pretty good, actually, that bit. I mean, it was very stressful, wasn't it, when in the early days with the dreadful and tragic images overseas and that sense. I'm going to try not to be too political, I know, because she told me not to be too political. But
I also
to be
know that the Senator
early
wears
on,
her
I did
heart
have
on her
I was
sleeve.
pretty stressed because we were engaged in a sort of, not a war cabinet, but a discussion with the government, and I did walk out of one of the meetings and say to my mum, just stay home, please. And we've seen some great tragedy. But I think it's I don't know what other people think, I think through this, some of the things that are important to us have become more clear, and how reliant we were on things which perhaps weren't as important has also become clearer, I think. And I think relationships, family and friends and community it's been underlined to me how important it is. I mean, I think you know that, but when you go through this as a community, when you go through this kind of crisis, that is really emphasised, isn't it?
I absolutely agree. And the importance of dogs.
Yeah, we got a dog. Which was actually a consequence or result of my eldest daughter relentlessly making representations for 3 or 4 years. She's pretty relentless. And I kept trying to divert. I kept thinking, anyway, it didn't work. And I just thought, well, I suppose we're home for a period of time, so we may as well get the dog. And so far, it's a black Labrador. Its name is Shadow, which I thought was a little bit kind of sad. Then Alexandra, our eldest, said to me, no, Mum, like, it's a shadow, like she never leaves you. I was like, oh, that's kind of sweet, isn't it? She had a completely different kind of set of meanings. Anyway, it's eating the furniture a lot.
It's eating the furniture. And I can't imagine where your eldest daughter learnt how to be relentless. I don't know where she might have got that from, to relentlessly argue a point until your opponent is just decimated.
I thought I could wait her out. She won.
Okay, on to very serious stuff.
Okay, very serious topic. I'll take my glasses off, which means I can't see you, but it's what I do when I'm being serious.
Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about COVID-19 and the huge impact that has had on the world, on global systems, on increasing global destabilisation. But things weren't all completely cheery before that, were they, in terms of the global realpolitik? We've had Trump for quite some time now. We had Brexit. So before all this hit, were you already a bit worried about the stability of the current rules-based order?
Look, I think you're right. I think we saw a disruptive dynamic in the world that predated the pandemic, and you've pointed to a number of markers of that. I mean, let's just go back a little bit further. I think by in the sweep of human history, the period since World War II has been amongst, or probably the most stable and most prosperous and most peaceful that humanity has seen. Now, I'm not suggesting, before somebody jumps up and reminds me of the various conflicts, of course there still have been wars, there still has been conflict, there still has been risk, but over the sweep of human history, a relatively stable period. I think what we saw in the period prior to the pandemic were that disruptive dynamic, those disruptive tendencies becoming more apparent. And you've identified, I think Brexit is one. Certainly the election of President Trump and his particular view about America's place in the world. I think also President Xi in China and the much more assertive stance China has in terms of its standing as a global player. And around the world, more nationalist governments, more nationalist leaders. But the pandemic has augmented and accelerated that, I think dramatically so. But I'm sure you can ask me more questions about that. So
As a matter of fact, I am.
I'll pause at this point.
Yes, you've got a way to go yet. So since then, things have certainly been exacerbated. And you wrote a great essay in Australian Foreign Affairs Journal called The End of Orthodoxy, Australia in a Post-Pandemic World, where you wrote that the virus could further unravel or even destroy the rules-based system we have known since World War II. So what does that look like specifically?
Can I just start with writing the essay? I wrote the essay during a period where we didn't have any exemptions for going backwards and forwards to Canberra, and because we had to go back to pass the JobKeeper legislation, I had 14 days, 3 days in Canberra, then 14 days. So out of 33 days, I think I was home for 28 days.
No wonder it's such a depressing read.
Yeah, I know. I did a fair bit on the trampoline to try and kind of be... but it was an interesting experience, actually, because there aren't many times, and I'm sure a lot of you have had this similar experience, in our lives, we think a lot, but we think quite reactively, or we process, we think logistics, or we problem solve, but there's not as much time for reflection. So it was quite useful intellectually, I think, and philosophically for me, because I got to really think and reflect upon what things meant. And it was an interesting experience at times, confronting, because it was like things were happening in real time. So I was writing about this disruption, escalating great power competition, and then I'd read things in the foreign press as it was playing out. Meanwhile, the dog was barking and the children were watching Lego Masters. So it was, good grounding.
Your own rules-based order was disintegrating.
What's the alternative? I think when we talk about multilateralism, then the rules-based order, it's probably useful to understand why humanity established it, to understand what the alternative is. I mean, the rules-based order that we have come to know and understand, the multilateral system that we are familiar with, was established in the aftermath of the most catastrophic and tragic and violent war humanity has known, World War II. And came, which are also, and there are much better historians than I in the room as well, so I'm just going to pick bits out, sorry about that, but which also arose out of or had its origins in the decade of the 1930s, which is characterised by nationalism and, frankly, racism and xenophobia. So after that period of human history, which is the bloodiest we've known, the countries of the world came together and said enough. And that's the basis of the multilateral system that we've known, in which Australia played a great part. So the establishment of the United Nations, other multilateral institutions, and the notion that we would, as a global community, have rules to try and manage conflict, engender agreement, to deal with, to find common ground. So I suppose the alternative to a rules-based order is not just disorder. I think it's conflict, competition and conflict, and enormous risk for humankind.
Do you want to theorise at all what sort of conflict is most likely to occur? That wasn't in the notes I gave you. I just threw that at you. Yeah.
That's a sort of strategic question, isn't it? Where are there risks in the world at the moment? There are so many risks. I mean, we have the risk of climate change. We have the risk of the pandemic. I think the risk of an absence of sound global institutions and collective agreement to observe certain norms is demonstrated by history, and it is conflict, and it means that where there is disagreement, you have a risk of conflict. Where there is dispute, raw power is never ameliorated or is not ameliorated by principle, values and rules. Now, I'm not suggesting we've had a perfect world multilaterally, but the flip side is far worse. So one of the points I make in the essay, I say, look, what are we facing? Greatest crisis since World War II, the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, a global pandemic, escalating competition, fraying multilateralism, rising nationalism. What do we have to do as Australia, and what do other like-minded nations have to do? I think we have to work together to try and shape the world in which we want to live and shape the region we want to live. And I can talk more about that, I guess.
We shall. I think one of the things that really surprised me when I first started covering federal politics was the number of those cross-governmental meetings. There's the CHOGM and the G20 and the PIF, lots of acronyms, don't worry about what they stand for, but that there are so many meetings of leaders which then have side meetings, or they have a casual but picturesque walk in a garden with another. There's a lot of sort of incidental conversations that happen, and I can see how, if that's not happening, and if people like Donald Trump are kind of refusing to engage with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, architecture, multilateral and plurilateral and regional architecture is useful to have forums, useful to have engagement, useful to try and build collaboration. As in international politics, foreign policy, as in life and as in your family, you have to build common ground, don't you? You have to find common ground. It doesn't just kind of appear. And I guess the architecture is one way of trying to engender that and foster that. I don't think the Trump administration's position, though, in terms of the effect on multilateralism is just because they don't turn up to the meetings. When there's a particular view that President Trump has about America's place in the world. which is fundamentally quite different to what we have understood as American leadership.
You also talk quite a lot about mistrust between nations. How does that manifest?
Well, I think, wasn't it, I thought it was quite, I find it quite emotionally confronting to observe what occurred after the pandemic, as the pandemic sort of played out globally. Because, and I think there's a line in the essay you can really read that I'm upset about it. You know, in the midst of the worst pandemic in human history, at a time where humanity really needed the nations of the world to work together, instead of cooperation, we have had rising mistrust and rising competition. And the cost of that has been in lives and poverty. I mean, that's the hard reality. If humanity had cooperated more and better on the pandemic, we would have fewer people who have died and also fewer people who will descend into poverty as a consequence of the economic downturn. We know from experience, for example, and it was obviously a different type of crisis, but during the global financial crisis, the coordination between nations, so the galvanising of collective action meant that the sum was greater than the parts. Your fiscal response, if you work together, economic response as you work together has a better return on investment, as it were. We haven't had that. In fact, we've had competition, we've had mistrust, we've had competing narratives about who was handling the virus better, where the virus came from, a whole range of misinformation, disinformation, and the utilisation of these events to further particular nationalist narratives. And all of that has meant that I think we are, as a humanity, worse off. The disputes around, obtaining vaccines and rolling out vaccines is a demonstration of that. And I think it is time for those of us who really believe in trying to find collective responses and in the merit of that to really articulate that. And the point I want to make about why Australia should do that, why we should be arguing for renewing multilateralism, defending multilateralism, arguing for, as I have, Australia to be engaged in galvanising regional and multilateral response, international responses, isn't just because we have a values belief. It is. I have an ethical, philosophical view, but it's also self-interest. We do better in a world which is more stable and more prosperous. We are more secure in a region that is more stable and more prosperous. So we actually have an interest in trying to ensure that multilateralism works, that countries trying to encourage and foster cooperation, that we shape the region we want. We have an interest in that. I did a podcast the other day I can't recall for whom, would have been the Whitlam Institute. That's right. There you go, Whitlam and Hawke. And they started it with Whitlam's address to the UN in 73, would have been. And I thought, wow, it really... he was much more articulate than I am, but I thought it's exactly the same argument. No, he says no other country's self-interest is more tied up in the collective interest than Australia's. And it was, I think, a lovely reminder of what leadership looks like.
And then, little political jab, we're just going to keep on going.
I softened it with a smile.
Yeah, she did. She really did.
To her.
And for Australia, is that because of our particular size?
Because I think we have global interests, but we're not a global power. Because, we care... we live in a region which is one of the most highly contested regions in the world. We are a highly trade-exposed nation. We are a nation that has always fared better when we economically and culturally engage with other countries. We're a nation, let's go through it, we're a nation that is deeply affected by climate change. We're a nation which is embedded in the global economy. We're a nation that, as I said, is in a region of rising competition. We have a pretty big interest in trying to make sure there's a way through this that isn't about competition. And one of the points I make is, in a time where you have this competition we see between the two great powers, and a time when multilateralism is fraying, there's a few things we need to do. We have to be more self-reliant and more ambitious, and we have to show leadership. We have to, I think, accept it's going to be harder to make our way in the world and actually step forward and do what we need to do. But one thing we should remember is we aren't the only nation who has these views. Leaving aside the two great powers, so the United States and China, who are in a very competitive...
We'll come back to that later as well.
Many other nations do understand and have a strong view about the importance of making sure there is an international order that has some stability and that has rules which are not predicated only on power.
I'm going to drag you back to mistrust because I think there's another dimension of that to explore. So you've got this mistrust between nations, America talking about the China virus, concerns about so on. But isn't it also an issue that there is this growing mistrust in expertise and authority? I think here in South Australia we've been relatively unscathed. The Premier has deferred quite a lot to Nicola Spurrier, but we're also seeing a bit of a breakdown between the federal government and the states in terms of that tension between the politics and actually listening to the experts.
She told me not to be partisan.
I know, right? And then I'm Dorothy Dixon. Well, more,
okay.
I've just thrown it to you. All right, then I'm going to pull it back a little bit. I wanted to talk to you specifically about that mistrust. Why do you think that is? People are, they're taking off on wild conspiracy theories. They believe, that there's a cabal of elites that are giving them false information, so they disbelieve the correct information. And therefore, we have that tension between what a health expert might say and then maybe a politician that bangs on about
hydroxychloroquine. We were trying to practice that. Hydroxychloroquine, is that right? Yeah. Where are the people, medical people in the room? Which was Craig Kelly, federally, who is promulgating some extraordinary...
Oh, he's right on that 5G horse.
It's 5G. Is he bad about vaccines too?
These things all seem to end up coming in together. So the mistrust and the misinformation, we have
that
the
is
country
probably
level,
a whole
individual.
Another discussion, including from people who might have, much more sort of academic qualifications than I. But I'm going to start with what we do about it. Democracy requires a certain village square. It requires us to at least have some agreement around facts. And it is entirely legitimate in our political system for there to be a discussion about, given these facts, what should the policy response be? That's a legitimate argument. It's one we've had. But it is actually corrosive for democracy to have political leaders telling you that facts which are facts are not facts. I think that is corrosive. We have seen that in climate. We've seen this in some nations around the world and in our own parliament around the pandemic. That's my first point. And responding to that appropriately is a function of leadership. And you need sensible people on all sides of the parliament to actually, in how they behave, understand, demonstrate in what they say and what they do that they have a respect for democracy, and by that I mean a respect for our institutions and our conventions. And I've been in Parliament, so I was elected in 01, got in 02, and I'll be utterly frank, and I'm not intending this as a sort of mean partisan comment, I find it quite disturbing the extent to which the dial on that has shifted and what people are now prepared to contest and what people are now prepared to do. When I was a minister, I'm sure I did a lot wrong and I made a lot of mistakes. But I'll tell you what, a couple of things I felt the weight of office and what that meant, and tried to discharge that as best as I could and honour that. But I also understood the place of the Parliament. And I can remember a couple of times in question time I made a mistake. And so I went in and I corrected the record because I understood in our system what that means. So when I observe the way in which accountability to the Parliament is being corroded, or I observe the way in which ministers, frankly, it's not even just a political argument, just deny facts which are there. I think that is corrosive. And I think in the democracy we have to expect different standards, or certain standards of our politicians. Political contest, I'm up for it. But I think it is wrong for us to go down the path of pretending certain things are not as they actually are.
And do you think politicians do it? Like, for example, Donald Trump has been indulging in the QAnon conspiracy theory, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's very complicated, but at the core of it is the belief that there's a global cabal of elites who are trafficking and abusing children and keeping them in pizza stores. It's patently untrue, but a lot of people believe very deeply in it, and it's got tied up with 5G and all sorts of other things. So Donald Trump has refused to condemn them, has even, in some senses encouraged them, and there's something like 30 people in the current electoral race who have displayed some kind of belief in QAnon. Do politicians, when they do, is it because they actually believe it, or is it because things like that, like hydroxychloroquine, I told you I would hesitate and then overthink it and fumble it. It plays into more like a culture wars sort of thing that then gets them votes.
Yeah, this is a bit like the question I was asked about, when I'm asked about, do you think someone's racist? I've been asked that publicly a number of times, and I usually say I can't see into their heart, but I can observe their actions. Because what you're asking is, what is motivation? Do they really believe it, or are they just deeply cynical and want to manipulate people? Well, that probably requires a bit more insight into their psyche than I care to engage in, to be honest with you. But I think after the what was his name? That's how quickly Fraser Anning. Do you remember the senator? He was only there for his period of time. And after he made the comments he made, I actually rang Matthias Cormann and I said, I want you to co-sponsor a motion about this with me, censuring him and articulating our support for multiculturalism. And I did that really deliberately because for me, as someone who has been who's been the subject of racism, I know how important it was for me during the Hanson and Howard debate. When Howard called for reduction in Asian immigration when he was opposition leader many, many years ago, and a number of Liberals crossed the floor. So there was a motion moved by Hawke in the House of Representatives. I think it was Hawke at the time, wasn't it? Yeah, and a whole bunch of Liberals crossed the floor. And I remember how much that mattered, that this was something above politics. So I guess what I'd say to you is there are some things which are above politics. And crazy conspiracy theories which are used to fuel hatred and division and to undermine democratic systems should be above politics.
That was very well and diplomatically put.
I don't know how diplomatic that was, actually. Just what I believe.
It was pretty well. On a scale of Penny Wong to Fraser Anning, it was definitely on that. Not a scale that will ever exist. No. Now, I love your phrase, macho nationalism. Can you talk to me a bit about what that looks like in the word? Feel free to name and shame.
Yeah, I knew you'd say that. In fact, when I wrote that, so I said that, what did I say? The politics after the pandemic had been characterised by macho nationalism. And I thought, I wonder what I'll get asked, like, who is that? And we sort of talked about how we'd manage that question, and actually no one asked it. Which it really demonstrates to me people get it. You just did, until now. But I guess people went, I know what she's talking about. I'm not going to name and shame. But I don't think it takes much to look around the world and see that we have a lot of nationalist sort of leadership on display. And it's not one country. I mean, I think it is a global tendency. Mr Morrison talked about the 1930s at one point in one of his speeches, and he talked about that being a time when I think strategic instability and economic, I can't remember what word he used, downturns, coincided, and that's true. But you know what I reckon the lesson of the 1930s are? is, the lesson of the 1930s is what happens when you allow nationalism to flourish. That is the lesson for humanity.
And how do you stop that in times like these, where people are turning inwards?
And I think one of the parts of your question earlier, which I didn't get to because it was already such a long answer and you were looking bored, she does this. I think partly why this is happening, and this is our responsibility, is that there is so much less trust in institutions, including in the political system. So partly why some of these things are occurring, the sort of conspiracy things, tendencies that you described are, I think people are not convinced that we act in their interest, that institutions act in their interest, and when you are disenfranchised and disengaged in that way, it's pretty fertile ground for people to say, well, it's actually QAnon or whatever. Insert horrible conspiracy theory, racism, etc., insert particular ideology. There was a Lowy Institute poll. I actually haven't looked at the last one, but there was one about, I think it would be 2 years ago, which showed this, and I think it was this very large proportion, 30-something%, 40%, something like that, of people under 40 who did not think democracy was necessarily the best form of government. And what that really said to me was, we've really failed to, collectively, and also politicians, we've really failed to explain or to connect about why it matters. So every time I go and talk to groups of young people, as you do as a politician, and they, why are you politics? Is it worth it? Blah blah. Sometimes not. I always say to them, you can make a decision not to be interested in politics, but you can't make a decision not to be affected. And if you're going to be affected, you may as well be engaged. And I make this point, our system actually depends on engagement. That the health of our democracy depends on people making sure you watch what we do and you hold us accountable, because if it's, they're all the same, people get away with a lot of stuff.
Those kids, were they then asked what they thought a better system was?
No, I haven't actually ever, the Lowy one, no, I don't. I haven't ever drilled down into that data sufficiently, but I suspect, and this is hypothesis only, I suspect it's a sense that, as I said, current governments, current institutions don't deliver for them. We're not very good at intergenerational equity in this country. So if you look at assets, you look at basically personal wealth plus climate, there's a lot of reasons why people who a fair bit younger would be pretty grumpy with us, and people older than us.
So how does Australia then tread that path of, we don't want to become insular? You've talked about how interdependent we obviously are in the world, but at the same time, because of this pandemic, we're talking more about sovereign capabilities, more about we need our own supply chains, because, we saw the rush on sanitizer and PPE and all that sort of stuff. How do you work out a balance between that feeling that Australia needs to be able to look after itself and reinforcing its place?
I think it's
in the
about
bigger world?
engaging on the world on the terms we want. So I don't think it should ever be about we don't want to engage. If we don't want to engage, then that way lies a much poorer Australia, economically as well as culturally. I think what it does mean is you think about what are your terms of engagement with the world? How do we want to best engage? So you're right. And it's really interesting, isn't it, the way in which human beings, we go to these binaries all the time. You're either here or you're here, and usually it's kind of about here is where the sweet spot is. So I think the pandemics have exposed the fragility of global supply chains, and we've seen that. I think there is absolutely a question which pre-existed the pandemic, but has been, I think, rings much louder now, which is what capabilities do we want here? What sort of jobs what sort of industries, jobs, knowledge do we want to make sure we have in Australia? A sort of sovereign capability argument. And that is a reasonable discussion. What it shouldn't morph into is a sort of argument for autarky, that we should just disengage from the rest of the world, because that's not actually going to help us.
Now, I love that word, autarky, but I had to look it up.
Yeah, I got told off by my staff because I used it twice in the essay and they said, it sounds like you're showing off. I'm like, no, it's a word.
It's a real word? Give us a little explanation of what would an autocratic, no, not autocratic.
No. Autarkic society would be one which was completely isolated and disengaged from the rest of the world, I suppose.
So in North Korea?
Are they an autarkic? I suppose they are. They do engage with China.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they've got a bit of cross-border stuff happening.
Yeah, no, that's a fair enough point.
But I think it's more an ideological point, isn't it? Because if you read some of the ways in which, particularly the hard right commentators, have not so much in this country but internationally, are talking about the pandemic, what their prescription is very isolationist. Just disengage.
Yeah, just pull in the planks.
Pull up the drawbridge. Yep.
One of the ways in which this balance, I guess, between being a global citizen and looking after ourselves first, one of the ways this is going to possibly become a practical problem will be when and if the vaccine is ready. And there's a lot of people who are very concerned about vaccine nationalism. I think America's gone out and reserved a whole lot of vaccines. I think Europe has done that. We've had this strange deal that's not quite yet a deal, but we've got a letter that says we might get a deal.
Well, we had an announcement.
And we've had an announcement about a letter that intended it. Anyway, you just let me die. You did. You just wound me up and sent me into that.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Talk to me about vaccine nationalism, because you can see that people would want to make sure that their leaders are going out and looking after them. But this could be an absolute crisis.
But instead of course, we all have a responsibility to look after our people. But surely we could actually work out how we work together to ensure one is developed, and then have a work out how we coordinate rolling it out. Instead of government sort of running off and trying to do all these deals with the private sector, surely we could work out how we actually globally coordinate and cooperate the development of it and then the rollout of it. And make a couple of points, We've got a fair bit of interest in yes, we have an interest in our people being safe and Australians being safe. We also actually have an interest in, the Southeast Asian economies continuing to function. We've got a pretty big interest in that. Again, just think for a moment, both the economic and strategic, the security implications of what happens if, one of the major Southeast Asian nations really gets into trouble. What would that mean for our security? So it's we have a self-interest. It's not just being generous-spirited. We have a self-interest as well as, I think, an ethical interest in trying to have less vaccine nationalism and more vaccine cooperation. Interestingly, I read a good article once about the fact that universities, a whole range of the researchers on vaccines were demonstrating, because there wasn't the multilateral cooperation, were actually just cooperating with each other anyway. So that gave me some hope.
Well, I was going to ask you about hope. Are you optimistic about that rollout?
On vaccines? We've not yet developed a vaccine for a coronavirus. This is not the first coronavirus we've had. Having said that, there's never been this level of resources and international focus on developing it. So, yes, I'm hopeful. I'm not close enough to it to know either time frame for development, extent of coverage, the extent to which it would actually work. And there's a whole range of things. I suppose one of the things I do say, though, is we shouldn't assume we'll go back to what we had. And there will be a new equilibrium in our society here and in the world, more in the global community. But it will be a different equilibrium, it will be a different normal. And in part, there's an opportunity there. That's frightening, But there's also an opportunity there to think about what do we want? What can we do in that world? And how can we work in Australia in terms of the recovery to learn from what we have learned through this, and in the world as a nation that recognises this is why I called it the end of orthodoxy, the essay, that the way in which the playbook which we've engaged in internationally since 1944, well, since the turn to America, is not actually going to work in the same way for us. So what do we want to do? Self-reliance and ambition is what I've talked about, but they're very high-level sort of conceptual propositions. So I think there are opportunities to remake it, in ways that matter. So if I think domestically, that's probably another question, isn't it?
Oh, well, no, I was actually just going to say, we really want to end on a nice note about what a new world could look like, so let's save that.
Okay.
Let's keep getting depressed, okay. And then we'll just bring it all up at the end.
I can do a lot of that if you want.
Optimism. Well, good, because now we're going to talk about the US and China.
Excellent. Because that hasn't taken up much of our thinking, has it?
It really hasn't. I feel as though we're very familiar with Donald Trump, but then our idea of China is a lot muddier because of, again, the binary way in which people sort of talk about it, and almost the stereotypes that start springing up. But things have changed with China. Can you talk us through a bit, like since Xi Jinping came into power?
Well, China is doing what great powers do, which is to assert its interests. So, that is unsurprising. But it's also pretty difficult, challenging for us at times. And President Xi has obviously a much more assertive and forward-leaning view about how China is to engage in the world and China's place in the world than Chinese leaders who preceded him. And that's I think, a more assertive China, asserting interests which at times are different to Australia's interests, is obviously a pretty challenging set of circumstances at times for us. So I think, to be very clear-eyed about it, we want a productive relationship with China, but we are going to have to learn to manage difference. We're going to also have to work to ensure both countries, our interests and our values and our sovereignty are respected, and that we resolve differences respectfully. I think it is a challenge. It's not a challenge that is made easier by kind of hairy-chested domestic politics being played, which I think you've seen some of that.
Yeah, do you worry that legitimate concerns about China's increasing belligerence very quickly can become...
I used assertiveness.
I said belligerence, it's fine.
No, at that time there have been behaviours which have been pretty difficult.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking South China Sea.
Absolutely.
When I think belligerent.
Yeah.
Does it concern you though that quickly can become racism and this application of China as this behemoth?
Well, not distinguishing between ethnicity and nation state. Yeah, of course. And I think my parents married when the White Australia policy was still in place, so we haven't been out of the world in which those sort of racist tropes are pretty conventional for that long, actually. So of course we have to always be conscious of that, and that is not made easier by the fact we've had some politicians who have been very clearly prepared to reference, implicitly or explicitly, those ideas, or talk in ways which emphasise ethnicity and race as opposed to strategic interests. There's this bloke called George Christensen.
And when you say hairy-chested, I don't know if you've all seen it, but there's actually a picture of him topless with a whip and a Virgin Mary tattoo?
Something. I averted my eyes. I just read the article. No, but, I think some of the things that he and some of the other coalition backbenchers have said aren't particularly helpful. So my view about that, all of us, we have these difficult challenges in our relationship with China. We have a lot more competition between the US and China. We have to navigate that. We have to do that sensibly and in an adult way. And we have to always be aware of the risk that what we say and what we do will be interpreted or seen by some with prejudice in their hearts. And, our job is always to combat prejudice.
I wanted to go on and talk about our close neighbours in the Pacific, and I just remembered an excellent anecdote that I will now share, but it has swearing, so, you can go away.
Am I in it?
Kind of.
Am I swearing?
No,
Don't tell me, okay.
You and I went to the Pacific Islands.
Yep.
I think it was 2016. Anyway, it doesn't matter, it's not a test.
Well, this was where I do remember this, with Julie.
With Julie Bishop, yes.
Who had a lot of outfit changes.
No,
I really remember this. I was like, wow, there's a lot of outfit changes in this day. I just wore the same thing all day long. I didn't know I was supposed to change 3 times. She was the minister.
She was the minister.
Yeah. So people,
And you have to be appropriate to each situation.
It's the Pacific.
Okay, anyway. I was doing this thing where it's starting to get political, so I felt like I had to take it
laid back.
I
don't know if you noticed.
It was pretty laid back. Anyway.
Shorts. We met the PM of whichever Solomon. He was in shorts and a T-shirt.
Shorts and the sandals. So we were being driven around by a local military guy. And he was pointing out various things that China had either paid for and given to various Pacific towns, or had sort of said, we'll build you this enormous 2,000-person sports stadium for your 200-person village, but then you owe us $10 billion forever. And so, I'm exaggerating,
She's
obviously.
exaggerating, just want to say.
Yeah. And this guy turned around and said, we call it shit diplomacy. And I said, oh, well, it's obviously pretty crap. And he said, no, literally, because they're building all these things for us, but they're importing the workers, the pipes, the toilets, everything from China. And when those China pipes meet a big South Pacific, everything gets blocked up and broken, and you can't even use the sports stadium. So that's why they call it shit diplomacy.
There you go. There's a little insight I've never had.
But that brings me to the Belt and Road Initiative in our near neighbourhood. Now, we've been talking about a Pacific step up. So obviously China is building systems through the Pacific obligations, one might say. And does Australia need to counter that influence?
Okay, well, the first thing we should do is we should never operate in the Pacific only on the basis that we're trying to counter something. We're for something, and we're for development and stability in the Pacific. And we want to be a partner of choice, not because we're trying to keep others out, but because it's our region. This is where we are, and we have relationships, we have people-to-people ties, we've got economic ties. We want to be a partner of choice, and I think we do that by ensuring we're genuine in our desire, as we should be, for the Pacific to develop, to be stable, to be prosperous, and we have to do that by being respectful. So, I don't think we've had the Pacific Step Up, which has been basically funded by a Southeast Asian Step Down, which is another own goal. I think that it's pretty hard to have an authentic policy for Pacific Island nations when you have the position that the current Australian government has on climate. Pacific Island nations understand in a way that is not even contested, but they understand deeply and viscerally what climate change means to them. It is an existential threat, it is a national security threat, it is an economic threat, it is a cultural threat. And the various statements from various forums in terms of from Pacific Island nations has been climate change is our number one threat. Climate is our number one national security threat. Even just recently, I can't recall, was it Solomon Islands or which leader, and because it struck me, even in the context of the pandemic, he said climate change is still our number one threat. And then we get Peter Dutton making a joke about water lapping at your door. I mean, what does that say? It doesn't matter how much you spend. Do you think people think you're authentic? Because you're not. So I don't think we have a real Pacific policy. We can't be a partner of choice unless we actually have a more mature and adult response on climate. Yes, of course we engage, because we recognise how strategically important it is, but we can't control what China or any other nation does. We can control what we do. And what we should do is try and be a partner of choice.
Penny looks embarrassed when you clap, so feel free to applaud very, very loudly. Thanks for bringing us to climate change, because that's one of the points you make in your essay as well, that we're not just going to get past this and it's happy days.
A few other challenges on the horizon.
There's a lot of people sharing, the shark that is the pandemic coming for our boat, or the bigger shark that is climate change that comes after that. What have we learned from our response to the pandemic in terms of, we can do big things quite quickly if we want to. So what is the difference between what we've done with the pandemic, listening to science, and what we should do with the climate change?
Yeah, Anthony always talks about that. How can people are prepared to listen to the science on this but not on that?
Yeah.
What should we learn? What's the question? She talked about climate change. I started to get stressed.
Shouldn't the fact that we listened to the science and responded in a fairly nimble way to this show that we can actually do that with climate change?
Yes.
And if not, why not?
I'm probably not the right party to ask that question of. And I mean that. Like, I just think on this, look, the world has not done what it should have on climate. And I tell a story about being in that small, very airless room at Copenhagen for many, many hours. And I remember thinking, and as I looked around, so you had Obama and Clinton, Merkel.
You name dropping.
No, I mean it. I'm in a room with these people. I'm from Kota Kinabalu, Malaysia. I'm going, oh my gosh, look at all these people. I'm sitting there just behind Kevin going, wow. Anyway, I can't even recall who everybody was there. Brown, it would have been, Gordon Brown. Zuma from South Africa. Anyway, and I remember thinking to myself, this room could do anything. The amount of political, economic and strategic power in this room, if they put their minds to it, they could do anything. And there are not many rooms like that in history. And the room didn't. And it was a bit of a sliding door moment.
Remind us of the outcome of Copenhagen.
So the Copenhagen Accord basically fell short of what we wanted. To be honest, actually, it created the architecture for the Paris Agreement. So essentially, we were 2 years behind, well, was it 2 years, or a number of years behind where we should have been. But it created the architecture for the Paris Agreement. But it was a pretty challenging thing. It was dreadful. It was horrible. And for a long time, I found it quite hard to comprehend that and then comprehend what occurred in Australia, notwithstanding whatever criticisms people had of our government, like the whole axe the tax, the whole, I can't remember all the slogans about climate that Tony Abbott ran. The people who believed that this was all made up, the fact that gained credibility, I found really difficult to comprehend, because I'd always thought, I guess, I kind of like the Enlightenment. Like, I sort of think, we live in a post-Enlightenment world, we assess facts, we come to rational conclusions, and humanity and our polity in Australia actually has been utterly irrational on climate. And it's pretty hard to understand why, isn't it? But, there are these theories about identity and the way in which it's used as a marker of identity, and that's why people hold on to it. So we've got to get past it. And I hope, but I honestly don't see the party that is currently in government, the coalition, ever being able to, because for them, there is a group of them for whom this is an issue of identity.
Once it becomes part of the culture wars, that's it.
It's just it. I mean, it is not a rational discussion. We've just had, is it our 19th or 20th energy policy released?
The gas-led recovery?
Yep. Or taxpayers funding somebody to build a gas station. When the industry is saying, if you just give us certainty, we'll invest. How about we do that? But that's only one component of it. I mean, just more generally, I just don't think... And it's really, I think it is sad. Like, from a national interest perspective, I think it is a sad thing.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. But let's go back to that global notion, that amazing group that you sat with in Copenhagen. But from reading what you've written, when it's going to be very hard to get anyone around a table like that again.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think it's allied and aligned nations have to work together on things that matter. And what are the lessons of the World Trade Organisation, which is that, you know, having complete consensus can be a block to progress. And actually, when I said the Copenhagen Accord created the architecture of the Paris Agreement, was because it actually enabled a degree of states being able to move at their own pace rather than waiting for everybody to have a big overarching agreement that went ka-chink. So I think the way we need to think about climate is how we work with others to build that agreement. I mean, essentially the world has already come to a position of agreeing, you know, how we're going to do it, which is Paris. What do we need? We need the United States to engage, and we need more ambition from the rest of the world that is already in the agreement, and we can play a part in that.
It's a horrible thought that with climate change will come more pandemics.
Absolutely.
And if we can't even agree that climate change contributes to bushfires, for example, which the United States is now doing with the wildfires, it'll be interesting now that people have mostly accepted that the pandemic is real, the connection with... Anyway, no, I'm going off on my own. Look, we're going to finish on an optimistic note.
Oh, okay.
I did warn you about this. And you started talking about it before, about a new normal that could be a better normal. Not necessarily on that global scale. I mean, you know, we may see revolutions there, but what is it that you can see that could be done differently now that we've kind of had this big smack in the face that's woken us up to how systems and relationships work? My original question was, could this be the death of neoliberalism?
Can I go back to where I started, which is what I think has become more important to us, personally and collectively? So I said, you know, family, friends, community, relationships. I think at a broader level, the importance of public health systems.
Workers.
I think the risk of insecure work. I think that really, I mean, it's been interesting because we have understood over a long period of time what's happened in the Australian labour market and the extent to which work has become less secure for many people. But we knew what that meant for people's capacity to generate or to build financial security for themselves and their families, et cetera, and we knew also there was a gender differential in terms of insecure work. But I think what the pandemic exposed is some of the consequences and risks of that. So, you know, I think a priority for Australia is and should be how do we address creating more security in work for people going forward. I hope globally what it demonstrates is how we all lose when we engage in competition rather than cooperation when we confront a common challenge. I hope that's what it demonstrates, and that's going to take leadership, and it's going to take alliances and partnerships with other countries who are prepared to work together. Albo talks about no one held back and no one left behind as a sort of way of talking about the sort of country we want. And I think we are where we are now, and we need to think about, okay, where do we want to be in 3 and 5 and 10 years' time? Because we do have an opportunity to rebuild and through the recovery, but rebuild with values and objectives that really matter to us. So I hope we take that opportunity.
Does sound like the end of neoliberalism. Maybe not quite. That and the wonderful distraction of puppies.
Absolutely.
Other good things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Senator.
Really appreciate it.